What would the world look like for everyday Americans if the U.S. were no longer the superpower? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport, and tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. At a time when American democracy is being tested at home, no relationship will shape its future more than the one with China. Face Off, the U.S. versus China is a podcast that takes an inside look at that turbulent relationship, the two superpowers, the two men in charge, and the vital issues that affect us all. When the podcast launched 3 years ago, many believed the U.S. could outmaneuver China's rise. That confidence has since faded, and what began as rivalry has hardened into a dangerous all-out struggle. It's playing out in trade and military posturing, as well as in the hearts and minds of young people on both sides of the Pacific. Our guest is Jane Perlez. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, former New York Times Beijing bureau chief, and fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Today, we'll go beyond the usual geopolitical scorecard to examine whether American democracy still holds a genuine advantage over authoritarianism. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free, and it really goes a long way. Check us out at youtube.com/Future Hindsight. Welcome, Jane. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Mila. Thank you.
So, for Americans focused on kitchen table issues, the U.S. China relationship can feel distant, abstract, unimportant. Why should ordinary Americans care about what's happening between these two powers right now?
I always think that it's good to be aware of the world around us, particularly today when the world is getting smaller and smaller by social media and various other means. But I think Americans should understand that China is a huge country, 1.4 billion people, an economy that's beginning to rival the American economy, a military that's not quite at the standards of the American military, but is getting there, and they're working assiduously to get there. And it's also a power in the Asia-Pacific, an enormous area where the United States has traditionally had a lot of power and still has a lot of allies. And I think it's good if Americans realized that this is no longer to be taken for granted. There are a lot of challenges to our allies in the Asia-Pacific, like Japan, our most stalwart ally there, is being challenged by China every single day. And other countries in the region, like Indonesia, where you are from, challenged every single day. The Philippines, a longtime ally of the United States, faces maritime challenges from China. So I think it's very prudent for Americans to understand China, which is, by the way, a fascinating culture and many fascinating people. And I think we should be aware of it.
Yeah, totally agree. Like you said, especially in the Indo-Pacific, there are so many old allies of the U.S. that I honestly feel are feeling abandonment from the U.S. government because it doesn't appear to be focusing there, especially now that a war just broke out in the Middle East. But beyond the headlines about tariffs and trade wars, military posturing, and TikTok, let's say, what do you see as the deeper long-term stakes for the United States?
Well, I think the fundamental stake is, will the United States still be the primary power in the world? Or will it secede that position to China, which is very happy, by the way, to take that place? And it's led by a leader, Xi Jinping, who's been there since 2012, who is extremely confident that his country can make it and overtake the United States. And so I think people have to recognize, do you want to have the great liberty of being the great, most powerful country in the world, or do you want to recede to a country that's got two coasts bordered by two big oceans and then just go about your business and ignore the rest of the world?
I don't think people think about it that way here in this country. I think they think about it totally differently. And I think a lot of Americans think about it in very narrow trade terms. Is Chinese manufacturing eclipsing the United States? And
Yes.
Yeah, yes. I always say yes. But I think people still don't really get it. So you have been covering China from the inside for a long time. And you just said yes. And like I said, there's this misconception that this is still a race. But what have you learned is the most persistent misconception Americans have about China that you wish you could correct?
Well, I don't think it's a single misconception. I think there's an overall misconception about China, which basically comes down to this. Americans just don't know very much. So I always use this example. Well, not always, because it's quite a recent example. We had a dinner party here in New York City, about a year ago. And we had a mix of people, lawyers, publishers, literary agents, all kinds of people. And in the middle of the conversation, someone said, "Oh, does China have nuclear weapons?" I nearly fell to the floor. This was an educated person who knew Europe very well, who knew the United States, but had no idea that China is making nuclear weapons as we speak and is catching up as fast as it possibly can to the United States and, if I may add, Russia. So I don't think it's a singular thing, Mila. I think it's an overall lack of knowledge, which would be great if it could be corrected. Or I don't mean to sound stern like that, but I think China, as I said, is a fascinating country, and there's a lot to learn.
Mm-hmm. I will just point out that the episode you had with the retired PLA colonel talking about how many more nuclear weapons China is acquiring as a secondary strike capability. I thought it was really fascinating. And I think people, like you said, people are not thinking about it and people are not cognizant that China has nuclear weapons.
But people are aware that a lot of the things that they buy in the grocery store, or a lot of the things they should be able to buy, in my opinion, like electric vehicles, are made in China. So they think of China as the place where they can get cheap stuff, like $6 irons.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other ways to think of China as well.
Of course, of course. As you mentioned, I'm from Indonesia, and now people there are buying Chinese EVs in a way that, that was not available 20 years ago. So I binge listened to Face Off Season 3, and I learned so much, especially about the malaise of Gen Z, the Chinese military, robotics, and Chinese soft power. And I'm going to do a plug for you here because it was so excellent that I have recommended it to all of my, international relations people. And I highly recommend it to all the listeners tuning in. Having done 3 seasons now, what has changed for you in the way that you understand what's going on?
Well, I would say that, I first went to China as a university student many, many, many years ago during the Cultural Revolution. So I've sort of seen China go through many, many changes. And I think what has changed in the last 3 years, which is a very narrow passage of time, is the increased determination of China to overtake the U.S. under Xi Jinping. But at the same time it's trying to do that, it is suffering its own economic doldrums. So Gen Z, you mentioned, for example, they are in a very unhappy spot. Why? Because there's about 20% unemployment among Gen Z in China. So while China sells all what I call these sort of shiny baubles overseas, and they look so great overseas because they sell all these EVs and they have amazing electronics and amazing tech savvy, on the ground inside China, things are not going so well. So in fact, maybe that will slow down Xi Jinping's aim to become number one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the change that I see. The economy was bad coming out of COVID, and it really hasn't improved very much. Why is it bad? Because there's a housing crisis. The value of property has gone down. Local governments are high in debt, and Chinese consumers are very hesitant to buy.
I want to focus a little bit here on the Gen Z aspect. In one of the episodes, I learned about the concept of garbage time, which is the sense among Chinese youth that the game is essentially over, right? That economic opportunity and political meaning have both dried up. Basically, Chinese Gen Z and American Gen Z are facing many of the same problems. So here in the U.S., why should Americans see this as their problem too, instead of simply a domestic challenge for Beijing?
Oh, I don't think they should see it as their problem too. I don't think the problems of Gen Z in China is something that Americans should worry about. That's China's problem. But I think it's a fascinating area and a fascinating subject because this is a country that wants to go full zoom ahead, and here's the most promising generation of their time sort of being stuck with 20% unemployment, no jobs. People I know in the Gen Z category are sort of slinking out, going down to the south of China into rural communities and having a nice time, thank you very much, because they can't get jobs that they want in Shanghai or Beijing or Chongqing or the big urban cities.
Right. Well, I think some of that is similar here in this country that, there's still the huge race for a lot of college students to be in investment banking, but you can't really get those jobs.
Well, they're more difficult to get. And Gen Z in China, and I think it's probably true here too, quite reluctant to marry and therefore quite reluctant to have children. And it's quite an irony because from the mid-90s or early 90s until about 2010, China had this really vicious one-child policy, which they enforced with great brutality. So if parents had more than one child, a second child could often be snatched by government officials and put up for adoption. But now they need young couples, and there aren't many young couples, but when they do become couples, they need them to have children to keep up the population. And they're not having children. So it's a big domestic problem for the government. So we'll see what happens.
I think a lot of young people also are not having children in the United States because it's prohibitive to raise children. It's so expensive to get childcare. It's so expensive to send them to school, and sending them to college is also really expensive. And you think, the common myth in the United States is still that if you get a college education, it's going to be upward mobility. And I think that hasn't been true for a lot of people. I have a democracy question.
Please.
In terms of how young people perceive the United States in China. Because for the longest time, we have thought about the U.S. as a beacon of democracy, and it's, a model for the world. And I wonder whether young people in China or any people in China are still thinking about the U.S. in this way, or, a lot of things have changed in recent years.
Well, obviously, with a very big population, you can have a huge diversity of opinion. But I do think, and it applies not only to China, but I think many countries around the world look at the United States now and say, democracy? Are you kidding me? When you have ICE agents going into big urban centers, migrants being forced to leave, when you have a president who declares a war without any explanation and then afterwards gives barely any explanation again, I think there are a lot of questions about how democracy really functions here. I think a lot of people in China, for example, are mystified that election campaigns here basically depend on huge donations of money by individuals. I had questions about that. How can you have a democracy if the candidates are favored by rich people? That's a good question.
It is a good question. Yes, we just had a whole episode about ending Citizens United last week. So if you have missed it, dear listener, please tune in, go back and listen to our conversation with Tiffany Muller. But talking about democracy and not really being a model, and youth around the world, especially if they want to have change in their government, it's not clear that necessarily China can take over. You have a whole episode on soft power, which I thought was really fascinating. America's soft power has always worked organically, like pop culture, rock and roll, universities. And there's an idea, I think, in the popular imagination that China will just step in and fill the void if the U.S. were to cede the ground. And when I listened to that conversation on soft power on your podcast, I was like, right, it isn't so easy. It isn't that you can just kind of go in there. So in the culture war of winning over hearts and minds and being the idealized superpower in the way that the U.S. thinks of itself, how do you think about the U.S., vacating the grounds?
Well, if I can just say about that episode, I think we were very lucky to have Da Wei, who is a Chinese academic who's come to the United States for many years, and he understands the United States. And he basically made the argument, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was difficult as a host of the podcast to say, China's not very good at soft power, and we're not going to really compete on that ground. And he's right, I just read, for example, that the Chinese have opened all kinds of new radio stations, maybe TV also in the global south. But in Africa in particular, I think it was a BBC story a couple of days ago, nobody's listening. People in Africa are not listening to the Chinese broadcasts because I haven't listened to them per se in Africa, but I know what Chinese broadcasts are like. And they tend to be very stiff, very tailored, very read from behind the desk, not terribly appealing. And I think Da Wei, our guest, was trying to say, China's not very good at soft power. So the world is still open to the United States if it wants to play. I think soft power would still be enormously influential in the rest of the world. Of course, China has come up with what I call some gimmicks, soft panda toys and various things that appeal on social media. But I don't think they have much staying power. And I'm not sure that China has a very good or amazing narrative to tell about itself. Maybe it does, Milan, but it hasn't really found how to tell it. I don't know if you agree.
Well, coming from Indonesia, which is a developing country, and it's always relying on foreign aid for trains, for sewer systems, all of these things. And China has notably invested so much in Belt and Road across the globe, especially in Africa, but also in Indonesia. And I think a lot of people, Indonesia specifically has been anti-Chinese for a long time.
Well, for good reason.
For good reason. The anti-Chinese sentiment has been so strong that really it's interesting to see how much it has softened in recent years. And so I feel like the Belt and Road Initiative has been very effective in changing the sentiment, even if it hasn't changed the narrative.
Well, maybe it did in the beginning, but you know what? A lot of countries in Africa, for example, went into huge debt over Belt and Road, and it's not so popular anymore. And China's not initiating big projects anymore because the countries are going to get debt relief from international banks. And this, you'd think it would be fairly embarrassing for the Chinese, but I don't think enough's made of this. But Zambia, for example, is up to its neck in debt from the Belt and Road project. And in Indonesia, as you say, they built this very smart, fast train from Jakarta to, remind me of the city. Bandung, sort of up the mountains a bit. But it's really not a well-traveled route. I mean, it seemed in a way to be more for show.
Yes, people take it, it takes 45 minutes as opposed to 4 hours. So people go to lunch now in Bandung. But also it doesn't go to the main station. You have to go to the out station and then take the slow train from the suburb, essentially, into the center of town.
And this is for the people who can afford to take the train. It's not for people who need to go to work every day. It's not improving a non-existent subway in Jakarta, which could surely do with a really great subway because the traffic is a nightmare even compared by the worst standards of the world. I was there when Xi Jinping announced Belt and Road. He went to a university in Kazakhstan and he addressed about 200 university students, and we all wrote big stories about how China was going to invest in the rest of the world. Well, it hasn't quite turned out the way I think they expected or we expected.
Yeah, fair point. We'll be back with Jane in just a moment, so stick around. You'll want to tune in to this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, are you numb to it yet? This wild ride of life we've lived lately, I mean? All this doom and gloom around AI, the constant geopolitical changes shaking up the globe, and the market is bouncing around like a yo-yo. It's no wonder most of us are hunkering down, saving, and looking for ways to protect our futures. One way you may have forgotten about is through the right life insurance policy. You've heard of life insurance, but did you know it's cheaper than you think? The younger you are, the cheaper it is. Like double the price if you wait to buy a decade from now. That's why so many are looking for a life insurance policy today with SelectQuote. I'd like to thank SelectQuote for supporting Future Hindsight. If you're new to life insurance, you're not alone. Thankfully, I've found SelectQuote. For over 40 years, SelectQuote has helped more than 2 million Americans understand their options and get the coverage they need. Over $700 billion in coverage and counting. As a broker, their mission is simple: to find you the right insurance policy at the best price. SelectQuote takes the guesswork out of finding the right life insurance policy. You don't have to sort through dozens of confusing options on your own. Instead, one of their licensed agents will find the right policy at the right price for you, comparing plans from trusted, top-rated insurance companies to find a policy that fits your health, your lifestyle, and your budget. And they work for you for free. You'll be covered faster than you think. SelectQuote works with providers who offer same-day coverage up to $2 million worth with no medical exam required. And you're not out of luck if you have pre-existing health conditions, because SelectQuote partners with companies that offer policies for people with conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, or heart disease. SelectQuote makes life insurance simple, even if this is your first time thinking about it. Head to selectquote.com/hopeful, and a licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget. Life insurance is never cheaper than it is today. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less and save more than 50% at selectquote.com/hopeful. Save more than 50% on term life insurance at selectquote.com/hopeful today to get started. That's selectquote.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Jane Perlez. I have another democracy question.
Please.
About journalists, because you're a journalist and you have spent many years in Jakarta, in Beijing, all over the world. And, we think about freedom of speech in the United States being curtailed a lot, but I think the same is true in China. So what's the lay of the land when it comes to journalism in China?
Well, I think there was a period perhaps in the 80s when there was quite a lively press in China. But since the squashing of the democracy movement in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, I don't think you could say there's been much freedom of the press. I mean, here and there have been some brave publications and some brave radio stations and some really good work done. But since Xi Jinping came to power, it's really gotten less and less. But on the journalism front, I feel very passionate about this, that actually it's not China's fault so much as the first Trump administration, which did something which they knew would result in curtailing American journalists' presence in China. Now, I think the way that Americans can learn about China is by having a lot of American journalists in China. But in 2018, the Trump administration decided to expel, I think it was maybe 60 Chinese journalists, about half the Chinese journalists in the United States, on the grounds that they were spying for the Chinese government. Now, I don't argue. I'm sure some of those journalists, maybe even more than half, were writing little notes to the security apparatus in China saying blah, blah, blah. But I think these notes were probably not terribly important. And my argument is better to have in front of you the Chinese journalists who may be doing this, so you know what they're interested in, so you know what they're doing, rather than expelling them and then risking the future of American journalists inside China. So, no surprise, in 2020, the Chinese government expelled half the American journalists in China. So we have very few American journalists in China now, which I think is a very serious situation. So, for example, when I was bureau chief in Beijing, we had 8 journalists in the bureau of the New York Times. Now there are 2, and 1 journalist who was able to eke out a 6-month visa but is not there full-time, or may not be there full-time. So it's a pretty sad picture. And, of course, the Washington Post has 0 journalists there, and the Wall Street Journal has 3, about to come down to 2, I believe. So that's pretty thin representation for such an important country.
It really is. Although, to your point earlier, I think a lot of Americans are simply not interested, even if you have the coverage.
But we can make them interested.
That's a good point.
Interested
yes, we can make them interested.
Because we don't only cover, when you're in a country like China, you don't only cover, the politics, you cover the sports, you cover, the Olympic Games from, the Chinese athletes, you cover the arts, the culture, all kinds of things that you try and bring the country alive.
Yes, this is a good point. So China is explicit about wanting to be the number 1 superpower. And I'm curious about how you think that kind of world would look like, but what are the elements that the Chinese think they must have in order to become the number 1 superpower?
Oh, I think they need to have a stronger military. God knows they have a strong enough military now, despite the fact that it's going through an incredible purge of its senior ranks. So let's see how strong the military remains. That's quite an interesting question. I think it's just going forward on economics. Xi Jinping is stressing like crazy that the Chinese have to be number 1 in tech. So the tech industry is getting all kinds of government support. One of the reasons that China is ahead of EVs, aside from the fact that the Trump administration is ideologically against EVs, but one of the reasons that China is doing so well with electric vehicles is those companies get huge subsidies from the government.
Right. Yeah, so it wants military and trade dominance.
Definitely. And in
Is that going to be
Asia-Pacific,
enough, though? Because if it doesn't have the soft power in winning the hearts and minds, I mean, how much,
I think that if China was to become number 1, it's very hard to predict. I'm not sure that they want to have countries follow their political lineup per se. Of course, it would be a much less free world, and it's not something I support. I'm not sure what a world would look like with China as number 1. There is, for certain, though, Asia-Pacific will look very different.
100% would look very different. Very, very different. I mean, I was very interested in the building up of the islands around the Philippines. And of course, being Indonesian, there have also been plenty of disputes with Indonesia on the outskirts of Indonesian international waters.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting situation. And I don't think the Americans really paid enough attention to China's designs in the South China Sea. The Chinese telegraphed very early on after Xi Jinping came to power that they were going to do this in the South China Sea. And they built these islands, these artificial islands where they now have military weapons and aircraft hangars in which they can immediately turn into bases, basically. But the Obama administration just sort of slapped them over the wrists and didn't do anything about it. Why? Because they were too distracted by Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, we are once again distracting ourselves in the Middle East. We're having this conversation shortly after the U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran, and China has condemned the attack, of course. How does this change the geopolitical picture for China?
Well, I think it must make them a bit nervous about one thing, their oil supply. They buy a lot of oil from Iran, so that's not going to be helpful. I think they will stick with Russia as their main ally. They're not going to do anything about that. And I'm not sure, if I was them, I would tell the world, look, we don't interfere in other people's business like the United States. We're different. We stand aside. We let countries do what they want to do. So in a way, they could make it into a propaganda win. Whether they choose to or not, I'm not sure.
Right. Yes, I read the press conference from this morning with the foreign secretary, and I thought it's so interesting because basically the secretary repeated over and over that they stand for peace and they want to help people negotiate and for the U.S. to cease and desist, military activity.
They say they want to help with diplomacy. They always say that. China always says that. But then it barely lifts a finger, so I wouldn't take that too seriously.
What would lifting a finger look like for China?
Oh, my God, you're talking about fantasy land. I
We
can't
can skip
imagine.
over
They've
this.
never done it. So
They've
how do
never
we
done
know?
it, so we don't know. Right.
We have no
right.
idea.
Yeah.
And they're just not conditioned to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I just can't see the foreign minister, Wang Yi, collecting the Iranians and the Americans on two sides of the table and banging heads. Not the way they do business.
Well, how do they do business? How do they do diplomacy?
Oh, they turn up a lot. Wang Yi, every year at the beginning of the year, he goes to Africa, does a tour of Africa. They're very super present at the United Nations, unlike the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And in an important area at the United Nations, they have worked assiduously to dominate the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So now they get their own way, and they have a majority of the votes there. And so the terrible situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province can't get a look in because the Chinese have basically paid so much attention to making sure that they have all the votes there that the United States looks pretty pathetic.
Yes, whipping the votes. Very important. So we are a pro-democracy podcast, and we are civic action-minded. And I know you're a journalist, and this may not be fully applicable, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights you've shared with us into action?
Well, I've thought about this a little bit, but it's very simplistic. I just encourage people to go to China, to visit China as a tourist. I assure you, I have no shares in Chinese travel agencies. But I do think it's important that people understand what the other side looks like. And aside from anything else, the food is great. The scenery is very varied. You can go from deserts to mountains to the seaside. The history is amazing, as Xi Jinping, the leader, never tires of saying 5,000 years of history. I mean, you don't have to listen to that. But you can see some of it in the great palaces in Beijing. And you can see the history of 20th century China in Shanghai, which is this great metropolis on a river. I just think it's important that we go there, understand, and don't need to agree with anything, or can learn a little bit or learn a lot. And I think you would find that Chinese people that you meet are very different kinds of people. Not all are brainwashed by Xi Jinping. Not all are rooting for the United States, but huge variety and many kinds of ethnicities. And so I think it behooves us to go and see what it's like.
Yeah, here, I'm into it. Well, I'm going to ask you also for a book recommendation, which you do in your own podcast. And for somebody who doesn't know anything about China, and as a first book, what do you recommend?
Oh, well, this is interesting. Nicholas Burns, who is a longtime State Department official, very senior official, is at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School where I make the podcast. And he went to China in 2021, something like that, to be ambassador. Mm-hmm. And he didn't know it well. So he asked me for a book recommendation. And I suggested a collection of essays by Jonathan Spence, a distinguished historian of China, called To Change China. They're very easy to read, and they start with a Roman Catholic priest who went to China in the 16th century, and it comes all the way through to the 19th century when many Americans went there, like the Rockefellers went there to establish universities and a medical center. And then it goes through World War II when there were Americans present during China's fight with Japan. And every essay basically ends with the following, that the foreigners left China with their tails between their legs. that they came to try and democratize China, to try and change China, but it doesn't work. So I think that's a kind of interesting lesson. But if I can, I would like to recommend another book as well, which is a little bit more contemporary. A friend of mine who was a journalist in China when I was there, Barbara Demick, she was there for the Los Angeles Times, and she found the most amazing story about so-called abandoned children. American families came to China in the 2000s, late 90s, to adopt children, and they all thought the children had been given up for adoption voluntarily to orphanages. But Barbara found, as many people did, that the one-child policy in China was very forcibly enforced, and she devotes the book to one family who were forced to give up one of their twins. And at the age of 22 months, this twin was forcibly taken from the family by the family planning officials, literally taken out of the arms of an aunt, forcibly. No papers, no nothing, just force. And then Barbara, through social media, was able to put the two twins who had been separated, she was able to bring them together. The twin who was taken from the arms of a relative grew up in rural Texas. And she was able to find this twin, and then she was able to tell the Chinese family that she had found the twin. And there are remarkable scenes towards the end of the book about the two girls coming together. It's very moving, and I think it illustrates the larger issue in great human terms.
Oh, thank you.
It's called Daughters of the Bamboo Grove by Barbara Demick.
Thank you. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, we're just talking as war against Iran has burst on the scene, and it's a little hard to be incredibly hopeful right now. But I think humanity in general gives me great hope. And I think in general people don't want war. And I think that people want to have successful lives and they want to have freedom. And I think that can prevail if we keep our common sense and lower the temperature a little bit.
You're here. Totally agree. Jane, thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the great questions.
Jane Perlez is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the host of Face Off, the U.S. versus China. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. If you have the means, visit China as a tourist. See the culture and meet the people. And if you can't swing a trip like that, at the very least, take the time to learn more about China by reading Jane's book recommendations, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove by Barbara Demick and To Change China by Jonathan Spence. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be joined by Adam Green. He's the co-founder of Progressive Change Campaign Committee, a 1 million-member grassroots organization building progressive power at the local, state, and federal levels.
One thing we've been really trying to do is challenge ourselves to find bold economic populists in the swing states and swing districts, and really kind of prove for America, particularly in this 2026 election cycle, that bold, inspiring economic populists, shake up the system outsiders, can win not just in blue cities and blue states, but in purple and red states as well.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Oh, and while you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way, I promise. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We are here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, consider subscribing to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/futurehindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.